Okay, let's talk about pollution. Now, this is an example that mainstream economists love to use as a case of market failure, and they have a supply and demand curve, and they show that the real cost curve of producing a podium like this is not just the wood or the plastic or the lumber or the insurance that went into it, but also the fact that when you make it, what you do is you hoist pollutants onto the property of other people, and they call that an externality or a negative externality or an external diseconomy. Let me tell you a story. Once upon a time, long, long ago, all stories have to start that way. In the 1830s or 1840s in the US, again, I don't know what happened in Australia or other countries, I get this from Murray Rothbard and a guy named Morton Horowitz, Horwitz, who was a Harvard historian of the mid-19th century. What you'd have was a little old lady, hate to be sexist about it, but I am, who would hang out her washing. This is in the days before the electronic dryer. And she'd hang up her washing and it would be wet and clean, and she'd come back 2 hours later and it was dry and dirty. And she'd go to the court and she'd say, that there factory 2 miles down the street, it put pollutants onto my laundry, and I want two things. I want an injunction, which means a ruling by the court that they cut it out, and I also want damages. They ruined my laundry. And in many cases, the court would agree. Not all cases, but in some cases, the court would agree. Or you'd get a case of a farmer who'd go to court and say, I had haystacks, and the railroad came by with sparks 300 feet in the air, and it got my haystacks on fire, even though they're on my private property, and I want damages and an injunction. And again, sometimes, many times, the courts would approve of this. These, what they were called then was nuisance lawsuits, but we would now call them environmental lawsuits. And the fact that the courts upheld private property rights had several benevolent effects. First of all, entrepreneurs, businessmen were led by Adam Smith's invisible hand to use more expensive anthracite coal rather than dirty but cheaper sulfur coal. Because if they used sulfur coal, they would get little old ladies on their case. There was even some environmental forensics in those days. You know what forensics is? You know, they have all these CSI shows where we're interested in blood and semen and hair particles and what's under your fingernails to figure out who the rapist or the murderer was. Well, you had environmental forensics. Here's a dust particle. Where did it come from? Let's go get them and get damages and an injunction against them. And you had incentives when you had a smokestack to put a mesh in the smokestack to catch most of the dust that would get out. And then every once in a while you change the mesh, M-E-S-H, and things were pretty good. Not perfect. There is such a thing called de minimis. We all exhale a poison, carbon dioxide. What are we going to do? Say you can't exhale carbon dioxide? That's silly. Every industrial product has some sort of a little bit of pollution. I mean, if you need an oxygen tent, don't move to Pittsburgh, because you're going to get something, even though you can sue them if they do these pollution type activities. Well, then came the progressive period in the 1870s through about 1910. And during the progressive period, a new philosophy overcame the courts in the US, and the philosophy was, we got to be number one. Who was number one then? Great Britain. How do you become number one? You get battleships, cruisers, tanks, guns, things like that. So the next time this little old lady or this farmer came into court in the 1890s, the court said, yeah, they're violating your private property rights. Your stinking, lousy, selfish private property rights. There's something more important than private property rights, and that's the public good. And what does the public good consist of? The public good consists of letting manufacturers trespass their dust particles onto your property. Well, if that's the way the law is going to be, if you were a green businessman, a Christian, somebody who didn't want to pollute other people, who wanted to use more expensive anthracite coal, who wanted to take steps to keep pollution to yourself, you would be at a competitive disadvantage vis-a-vis the other people who had no such niceties, and they would drive you out of business, assuming equal, ceteris paribus, other equal abilities. So now the law system was working in a very perverse way. And there was Murray Rothbard quotes some Georgia state court, the Supreme Court of Georgia, saying that, did I say something wrong? Okay. The Georgia Supreme Court said something to the effect that pollution is legitimate. It's legal. You can't stop pollution. Well, if you have that kind of a legal system, of course you're going to have pollution. And then things got pretty bad in the mid-20th century, and then they had to come up with the EPA. But the problem was created in the first place by the courts not upholding property rights. One argument against this is, well, what are you going to do? Sue every automobile owner for pollutants? And you have to, I don't know how many automobile owners there are in Australia or the US, but there are plenty of them, and it would be unfeasible to sue each and every one of them. And also, each and every one of them only contributes this much, namely de minimis amount of pollution. So it wouldn't work. And Murray Rothbard's answer to that was, well, if we had private highways, a point that I'll get to in my lecture tomorrow, then you wouldn't have to sue each automobile owner. What you would do is sue the highway, the private highway, for running a bawdy house of pollution or something like that. And then the owner of the road would turn around to his customers and say, look, you can ride without a catalytic converter. You can pollute a lot, but we're going to charge you 10 times as much. So the market would then work toward reducing pollution. And then they have to have the EPA, which comes up with all sorts of problems about, how big your toilet bowl can be and all sorts of stuff like that. But the cause of pollution is not the free enterprise private property rights system. The cause of it is the very abnegation of this.